Book 2, Chapter 1 of Michael Strogoff, Courier of the Tsar. This recording is in the public domain. Michael Strogoff by Jules Verne. Book 2, Chapter 1 A Tartar Camp. At a day's march from Kolyvan, several versts beyond the town of Diachinks, stretches a wide plain, planted here and there with great trees, principally pines and cedars. This part of the steppe is usually occupied during the warm season by Siberian shepherds and their numerous flocks. But now it might have been searched in vain for one of its nomad inhabitants. Not that the plain was deserted. It presented a most animated appearance. There stood the Tartar tents. There Feofar Khan, the terrible Emir of Bokhara, was encamped. And there on the following day, the 7th of August, were brought the prisoners taken at Kolyvan after the annihilation of the Russian force, which had vainly attempted to oppose the progress of the invaders. Of the 2,000 men who had engaged the two columns of the enemy, the bases of which rested on Tomsk and Omsk, only a few hundred remained. Thus events were going badly, and the imperial government appeared to have lost its power beyond the frontiers of the Ural. For a time at least, for the Russians could not fail eventually to defeat the savage hordes of the invaders. But in the meantime the invasion had reached the center of Siberia, and it was spreading through the revolted country both to the eastern and the western provinces. If the troops of the Amur and the province of Takutsk did not arrive in time to occupy it, Irkutsk, the capital of Asiatic Russia, being insufficiently garrisoned, would fall into the hands of the Tartars, and the Grand Duke, brother of the Emperor, would be sacrificed to the vengeance of Ivan Ogareff. What had become of Michael Strogoff? Had he broken down under the weight of so many trials? Did he consider himself conquered by the series of disasters which, since the adventure of Ichim, had increased in magnitude? Did he think his cause lost, that his mission had failed, that his orders could no longer be obeyed? Michael was one of those men who never give in while life exists. He was yet alive, he still had the imperial letter safe, his disguise had been undiscovered. He was included amongst the numerous prisoners whom the Tartars were dragging with them like cattle, but by approaching Tomsk he was at the same time drawing nearer to Irkutsk. Besides, he was still in front of Ivan Ogareff. "I will get there," he repeated to himself. Since the affair of Kolyvan all the powers of his mind were concentrated on one object, to become free. How should he escape from the Emir's soldiers? Feofar's camp presented a magnificent spectacle. Numberless tents of skin, felt, or silk glistened in the rays of the sun. The lofty plumes which surmounted their conical tops waved amidst banners, flags, and pennons of every color. The richest of these tents belonged to the Seids and the Khodjas, who are the principal personages of the Khanate. A special pavilion, ornamented with a horse's tail issuing from a sheaf of red and white sticks artistically interlaced, indicated the high rank of these Tartar chiefs. Then in the distance rose several thousand of the Turcoman tents, called Karioi, which had been carried on the backs of camels. The camp contained at least 150,000 soldiers, as many foot as horse soldiers, collected under the name of Alamanes. Amongst them, and as the principal types of Turkestan, would have been directly remarked the Tajiks, from their regular features, white skin, tall forms, and black eyes and hair. They formed the bulk of the Tartar army, and of them the Khanates of Khokhand and Koundouj had furnished a contingent nearly equal to that of Bokhara. With the Tajiks were mingled specimens of different races who either reside in Turkestan or whose native countries border on it. There were Uzbeks, red-bearded, small in stature, similar to those who had pursued Michael. Here were Kirghiz, with flat faces like the Kalmucks, dressed in coats of mail. Some carried the lance, bows, and arrows of Asiatic manufacture, some the saber, a matchlock gun, and the shakane, a little short-handled axe, the wounds from which invariably prove fatal. There were Mongols, of middle height, with black hair plaited into pigtails, which hung down their back, round faces, swarthy complexions, lively deep-set eyes, scanty beards, dressed in blue nankeen trimmed with black plush, sword belts of leather with silver buckles, coats gaily braided, and silk caps edged with fur and 3 ribbons fluttering behind. Brown-skinned Afghans, too, might have been seen, Arabs, having the primitive type of the beautiful Semitic races, and Turkomans, with eyes which looked as if they had lost the pupil, all enrolled under the Emir's flag, the flag of incendiaries and devastators. Among these free soldiers were a certain number of slave soldiers, principally Persians, commanded by officers of the same nation, and they were certainly not the least esteemed of Feofar Khan's army. If to this list are added the Jews who acted as servants, their robes confined with a cord, and wearing on their heads instead of the turban which is forbidden them, little caps of dark cloth, if with these groups are mingled some hundreds of kalenders, a sort of religious mendicants, clothed in rags, covered by leopard skin, some idea may be formed of the enormous agglomerations of different tribes included under the general denomination of the Tartar army. Nothing could be more romantic than this picture, in delineating which the most skillful artist would have exhausted all the colors of his palette. Feofar's tent overlooked the others. Draped in large folds of a brilliant silk looped with golden cords and tassels, surmounted by tall plumes which waved in the wind like fans, it occupied the center of a wide clearing, sheltered by a grove of magnificent birch and pine trees. Before this tent, on a japanned table inlaid with precious stones, was placed the sacred book of the Koran, its pages being of thin gold leaf delicately engraved. Above floated the Tartar flag, quartered with the Emir's arms. In a semicircle round the clearing stood the tents of the great functionaries of Bokhara. There resided the chief of the stables, who has the right to follow the Emir on horseback even into the court of his palace; the grand falconer, the Hoshbegui, bearer of the royal seal; the Topshi Bashi, grand master of the artillery; the Khodja, chief of the council, who receives the prince's kiss, and may present himself before him with his girdle untied; the Sheikh ul Islam, chief of the Ulemas, representing the priests; the Kazi Askev, who, in the Emir's absence, settles all disputes raised among the soldiers; and lastly, the chief of the astrologers, whose great business is to consult the stars every time the Khan thinks of changing his quarters. When the prisoners were brought into the camp, the Emir was in his tent. He did not show himself. This was fortunate, no doubt. A sign, a word from him might have been the signal for some bloody execution. But he entrenched himself in that isolation which constitutes in part the majesty of Eastern kings. He who does not show himself is admired, and above all, feared. As to the prisoners, they were to be penned up in some enclosure, where, ill treated, poorly fed, and exposed to all the inclemencies of the weather, they would await Feofar's pleasure. The most docile and patient of them all was undoubtedly Michael Strogoff. He allowed himself to be led, for they were leading him where he wished to go, and under conditions of safety which free he could not have found on the road from Kolyvan to Tomsk. To escape before reaching that town was to risk again falling into the hands of the scouts, who were scouring the steppe. The most eastern line occupied by the Tartar columns was not situated beyond the 85th meridian, which passes through Tomsk. This meridian once passed, Michael considered that he should be beyond the hostile zones, that he could traverse Jeniski without danger, and gain Krasnoiarsk before Feofar Khan had invaded the province. Once at Tomsk, he repeated to himself, to repress some feelings of impatience which he could not entirely master, in a few minutes I should be beyond the outposts, and 12 hours gained on Feofar, 12 hours on Ogareff, that surely would be enough to give me a start of them to Irkutsk. The thing that Michael dreaded more than everything else was the presence of Ivan Ogareff in the Tartar camp. Besides the danger of being recognized, he felt, by a sort of instinct, that this was the traitor whom it was especially necessary to precede. He understood, too, that the union of Ogareff's troops with those of Feofar would complete the invading army, and that the junction once effected, the army would march en masse on the capital of Eastern Siberia. All his apprehensions came from this quarter, and he dreaded every instant to hear some flourish of trumpets, announcing the arrival of the lieutenant of the Emir. To this was added the thought of his mother, of Nadia, the one a prisoner at Omsk, the other dragged on board